Gulls were flying near the port of Leth calling, and one of these birds landed on a pole sticking out of the water. It froze in surprise and turned its attention to the ship coming closer. Some of the other birds flew out of the way to avoid colliding with the sails as the ship sailed closer to the dock, stopping next to it. Raymond, who was on board the ship, smiled happily, shouting that he and his comrades were finally here. As he stepped off the side of the ship and onto the dock, he stopped, raised his hands in the air in joy, and laughed. Some people looked at him in disbelief as he caught their attention with such a reaction to his arrival. Having calmed down a bit, Raymond started to look around, noticing a girl off to the side who smiled and told the person who came up to her that he could only purchase the potion after doing her a favor. Another man, picking up a fish by the tail, announced that he had the best price, asking people to buy fish. A large number of people here also offered their services, and someone asked if the person who came closer was looking for a warehouse where they could store their items. Someone else offered to train with them if they wanted to travel the world of Maple, and someone asked where this person's brother was. Raymond, looking ecstatically at everything around him, called out that this was the port city of Leth. At this time, Walker came closer to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and smiled, asking if he was happy. Raymond, his smile only growing stronger, called out Walker's name happily as he looked at him and asked him to tell him that he was thrilled. Walker said nothing but continued walking with Raymond, his hand still on his shoulder. Suddenly the Tan came closer to them, narrowing his eyes and smiling. He honestly admitted that he wanted to tell everyone in this port about how he was feeling. Next to him, Charlotte smiled too but didn't say anything. And Dang raised his head and announced that he wanted to tell everyone how he felt because this was where their adventure would begin. Together with Charlotte, he caught up with Raymond and Walker, who had already gone ahead, and went with them into the streets of the city. It was a time when adventurers from all over the world wrote their own stories about grand journeys. Back then, in the dark dungeons, they frowned seriously as they prepared to use their skills while holding their weapons at the ready. This was the era of adventure, and the gate was the only portal that suddenly began to appear all over the world. Passing through these portals, adventurers found themselves in other places, worlds where scary and unknown monsters lived. These monsters were huge in size with sharp fangs and claws, and they fiercely fought against humans. Countless adventurers had died inside the gate, but the rewards for winning undoubtedly outweighed the risks. This made ambitious people continue to explore new worlds. Such rewards were chests, jewelry, weapons, and all sorts of household items. Currently, Walker announced, with a serious frown, that they needed bait. Sticking out a finger, his team members looked at him in disbelief, their eyes wide with amazement. He noted that it was impossible to come up with a strategy before entering the gate, since there was no telling what to expect. Holding up images of scary monsters in his mind, he announced that adventurers in many seasons had lost their lives in unforeseen circumstances. For this very reason, now people were hiring bait slaves. Charlotte closed her eyes and realized that these were the people who would distract the monsters' attention while they ran away from the battlefield. She thought it was a good idea. Raymond frowned at that, turning to Charlotte and asking her what she was saying. Sometime later, in a place where people were sitting in cramped rooms covered with bars, a man smiled, greeting Walker and admitting that he was glad to see him here. He explained that this place was owned and operated by the Geport Trade Guild, and noted that all the people here were decoy slaves. He expressed hope that they would find a suitable product for Walker. He also added that these slaves would definitely recoup the cost by guaranteeing their usefulness. He couldn't stop smiling broadly and added that he could recommend 2 slaves if Walker would let him. Walker didn't say anything but watched him seriously. The man pointed to one of the bars and showed Walker the 2 guys who were behind it, telling him that he had just received these guys, so they were relatively fresh. After hearing this explanation, Walker decided that he would buy them both, and the man exclaimed that it was an impeccable choice, praising Walker for his good taste. He wished him luck on his journey. After a while, Walker, Raymond, then Charlotte, Elam, and another decoy slave came to the gate. Pausing briefly in front of it, Walker drew his dagger from its scabbard, walked over to the tree that formed the edge of the gate, and frowned gravely. He explained that adventurers left marks on the trunk to show how many teams had entered that particular gate. He noticed that there wasn't a single mark on this tree, which meant they would be the first. With a sharp twitch of the dagger, he left a deep scratch on the tree trunk and then, grinning, looked at his companions. Walker asked if they were ready. Noticing the enthusiastic smiles on the faces of his companions, he suggested that they go ahead, and soon they were transported through the portal to another world. Raymond squeezed his eyes shut and ran forward a little, admitting that it was a very strange feeling. But suddenly he froze, eyes wide, and cried out in delight when he noticed the huge mushrooms in front of him. He was amazed and confessed that he had never been to such a quaint place before. The atmosphere wasn't quite what he'd imagined, but to distract him from the excitement, Walker gravely warned that none of the contestants should panic and that they should keep going. He also said that the portal usually opens far from the lair of monsters, so they were still safe. Elpam and the other decoy slave froze, their mouths hanging open in shock, while Walker ignored them and started walking forward. He told them that they couldn't leave by the same route they had come, so their priority was to determine the location of the exit portal. Everyone was silent, listening intently. At that moment, a monster suddenly appeared behind Charlotte, who was walking at the end of the line. Hearing a strange sound behind her, she opened her eyes wide and turned around, but she didn't have time to do anything as the monster jumped up and attacked her from behind, opening its mouth wide. She only managed to ask, "What is it?" before blood splattered into the air. Hearing Charlotte's scream and the sounds of the monster, everyone turned around abruptly, asking why there were monsters here. They didn't understand how this had happened and readied their weapons to fight. Raymond, alarmed, called out Charlotte's name, but very soon everyone was distracted again as they heard another loud sound. They turned around to see another monster jumping closer. In addition to these monsters, a large number of others approached. All the team members shouted in horror that this monster was not alone. There was a whole horde of similar creatures. They all stood with their weapons ready. With a curse, Walker took out his staff, activated his magic, and used a fire arrow, drawing it on the string that appeared. With a frown, he aimed and released a fire attack toward the monster that had attacked Charlotte. The monster opened its mouth in surprise, released Charlotte, and jumped out of the way as the attack hit. Charlotte's body fell to the ground nearby, and Walker, knowing something was wrong, frowned as he ordered the rest of his team to tie their baits to a tree. He announced that they needed to get out of there. One of the decoy slaves, in a trembling voice, begged the crew members to stop and take them with them. However, ignoring his desperate pleas, Dean pulled out a dagger and pointed it at the boy, telling him to shut his mouth and stand still. Raymond, who was clenching his jaw as he tied the chain that held the two slaves to a tree, squeezed his eyes shut, saying over and over that he was sorry. Despite his emotion, he soon began to run away with the rest of his crew, leaving the slaves behind, who, looking after them desperately, asked them not to go. They couldn't believe they were being left there. Meanwhile, Taylor, Raymond, and Walker were running away with Charlotte on their backs. The monsters headed toward Elpam and the other guy who were tied to the tree. One of the monsters immediately pounced on the defenseless man, tearing him with its fangs and claws. He screamed, feeling blood pouring out of his wounds. Elpam, who was holding a spear, turned to look at him and suddenly felt another monster reach for his back. At the same time, the team members continued to run. After stopping briefly, Walker bent over from fatigue and began to breathe heavily, announcing that the task was postponed. He knew there was no time to hunt monsters now, so he decided they needed to find a way out as soon as possible. His brow furrowed in frustration, but he was suddenly distracted when he noticed Raymond standing a little way away, frozen, eyes wide and panting in panic. After shouting his name several times, his team members tried to get him to wake up, but he continued to ignore them. Finally, then ran over, grabbed him by the collar of his clothes, yanked sharply, and ordered him to wake up. Raymond finally focused on his comrades, who ordered him to listen to Walker's instructions. Frowning, he shouted for him to calm down. Even though their adventure had completely failed this time, he assumed they could prepare better and try again. It was still too early to give up. He warned them not to let their guard down. Then he grinned resolutely, clenching his hand into a fist, and added that they would all survive together. In the next instant, a monster appeared behind him, raising a paw to strike. It pinned the team to the ground, causing dust and rock fragments to rise into the air, and a dent formed in the ground. The force of the shockwave sent Raymond flying out of the way, losing his balance. Walker jerked violently to the side, sliding out like Teen. At this time, the monster raised a bloody paw and looked at the destroyed body of Teen. Raymond, trembling, said the name of his comrade. Looking at his remains, he opened his eyes wide in horror. Walker, putting Charlotte's body aside, raised his staff and used it to create fire. Arrow drawn, and before releasing the attack, Walker called the monster a name. The monster didn't wait for him to strike, but turned sharply in his direction, releasing a long tongue that wrapped around Walker's neck. Frowning, he cried out in surprise at what had happened, and the monster continued to hold him down with its tongue, dragging him closer to its jaws. Walker desperately asked for someone to help him, trying to break free, but nothing worked. In the next instant, blood splattered into the air, followed by a crunch and a scream. Raymond's eyes widened, his jaw clenched, sweat trickled down his face, and tears formed at the corners of his eyes. He continued to sit there, frozen in place, staring in horror at what was happening around him. He tried to deny everything that was going on and suddenly noticed that the monster, with Walker's body parts sticking out of its bloody mouth, started to get closer to him. He cried out for help and, unable to get to his feet, tried to crawl away. But he couldn't move fast enough. The monster opened its mouth and dropped Walker's remains to the ground, then wrapped its tongue around one of Raymond's legs. The monster pulled him closer to its mouth, clenching its teeth tightly. Raymond screamed in pain. He felt sorry for his leg and continued to cry out. Meanwhile, Elpam carefully sat down on a branch of one of the trees and froze, watching what was happening. Blood splattered all around Raymond, dripping from the monster's fangs. He lay there, his hands clenched into fists, trembling. He squeezed his eyes shut and clenched his jaw to stifle a scream. Suddenly he looked up and noticed Elpam nearby. Surprised, he asked if this was really their bait. The main character just stood there with his lips pressed tightly together. Raymond raised a trembling hand in the air, pointed toward Elpam, and expressed relief that he was alive. He said it was a great relief and asked Elpam to help him quickly. Looking at him with hope, he said everyone else was dead and only the two of them were left. He apologized for what had happened and suggested that Elpam could see he had been against it from the start. He was sure Elpam couldn't get out of here alone and offered to work together. Continuing to stretch his hand up, he clenched his jaw to stifle another cry and desperately asked Elpam to help. Suddenly losing his composure, Raymond shouted angrily, ordering Elpam to stop standing idly by and help him. He called him names, and when he did, the main character smiled slightly but still didn't say anything. Finally, he jumped down from the tree, landing in front of Raymond. He confessed that even if he truly wanted to help, he was afraid it was too late. More than half of Raymond's body had already been swallowed by the monster. As if coming back to reality, Raymond froze, eyes wide with amazement, and looked at his reflection in the pool of blood formed by his wounds. His face was covered in sweat, and tears were running down his cheeks. He chuckled bitterly, called Elpam a stupid slave, and asked if she really believed she could survive alone. He scowled furiously, warning that it would be Elpam's turn next. Then, the monster's jaws closed completely, engulfing Raymond and leaving only his hand sticking out of its teeth. For a moment, the monster froze, chewing the mangled body. Then it threw aside Raymond's remaining arm and growled, turning its gaze toward the main character, who calmly stood in front of it, holding a spear at the ready. Moving to a more comfortable stance, the monster readied itself to charge forward. Abruptly, it kicked off the ground and rushed toward Elpam, mouth open in anticipation. Still, Elpam stood calmly, then with a determined frown, announced that he thought he could survive. He held out his weapon, preparing to fight. With a powerful strike, he pierced the monster's body. When the monster collapsed to the ground, Elpam froze for a moment, unmoving. Then, covering his face with one hand, he said that he would survive because this was not the place where he would die. As he said that, he ran a hand over his face, lifted it, and pushed back some of his hair while looking sadly straight ahead. He recalled how, before he had returned, he had stood together with a few other members of his team, looking at the massive number of monsters flying through the sky. The forest, visible from the edge of the cliff where they had stood, was burning in some areas, smoke rising into the sky. In other places, it was destroyed by massive rocks falling from above. Noticing one of the enemies ahead, Elpam realized what kind of monster it was. He focused on the large number of creatures flying closer. One of them opened its mouth and growled menacingly. These monsters, as well as the dragons flying with them, were small compared to another monster that appeared many times their size. It was a horn-tailed beast, and as Elpam looked at its 3 heads, he declared it to be the Dragon King. Elesis thought about it and realized that this meant the centaur nest had also been destroyed. She announced that they had no one else to rely on, because from the Knights of Sickness, the Resistance, the Crusade, the Hunters and Adventurers, to the 6 heroes that people had placed their hopes on, all were dead. She was saddened by this fact, and after focusing her attention on the main character in front of her, she announced that only he, the last adventurer, was left. Hearing her say his name, Elpam frowned in concentration as he turned around and told his team members to go, because a battle awaited them. As he readied himself, the shadow of the Dragon King flew over them. Noticing the monster opening its mouth wide as it rushed down, intending to attack, the protagonist activated his magic and warned that this was their last adventure. When a certain amount of time had passed, the entire area was covered in smoke and fire. Elpam, whose clothes and body were soaked in blood, stopped with his mouth slightly open, blood dripping from the corners of his lips. His entire face was smeared with blood and he fell to his knees, avoiding the corpses lying around him. One of the monster's severed heads lay on the ground in front of him, but the protagonist didn't look pleased by the outcome. Raising his head, he asked himself, "Is this the end?" He focused his attention on the monster still flying through the air with a growl. Although one of its heads had been severed, the other two were fully functional, unaffected by the damage. Elpam thought they had dealt a heavy blow, but had only managed to cut off one head, only to see it recover again. Noticing that the stump where the dragon's neck had been severed began to regenerate, the main character realized all their efforts had been in vain. As he thought about this, the dragon turned sharply in the air, flying downward with its mouth wide open, one of its heads aiming straight at Elpam, intending to finish him off. Elpam narrowed his eyes at first, then closed them, thinking this was truly the end. Lowering his head, he quietly said this was the end of their world and adventure. Clenching his hand into a fist, he slammed it into the ground in front of him with such force that it left a dent. He swore furiously, ignoring the fire, smoke, and dust surrounding him. He clenched his jaw in anger, opened his eyes wide, and shouted that it couldn't end like this. He was so tense that veins bulged visibly across his face. Going back in his mind, he thought of Philip killed by the monster. Falling to his knees, Elpam had only been able to stretch his hand out toward his fallen comrade, unable to do anything to save him. Then he remembered Jaden, how he had sat beside his bloody comrade during battle, holding his hand. Alice had also died, and now Elpam recalled how she had pushed him away, exposing herself to the monster's fatal blow and sacrificing her life. When she looked at him one last time, she smiled. Even though tears were streaming down her cheeks, she didn't let fear show. Now remembering all of this, Elpam shouted what all his comrades had given their lives for. Unable to contain his emotions, he screamed to the sky. With a final effort, he stood up. Managing to stay on his feet, he resolutely frowned, mentally turning to face his opponent. He sighed heavily and promised that he would not die so easily. Raising his hand, he pointed his palm at the monster. With a cry of effort, he began to form a magic spell, accumulating energy into a single point. The energy around him intensified, growing stronger and stronger. Elpam formed a brightly shining arrow and promised he would kill Horntail, even if it was the last thing he ever did. However, before he could cast the spell, his hand suddenly shuddered, and the gathered energy shattered, flying apart. The main character had pushed himself too far. His body was completely exhausted. Spitting up a clot of blood, he staggered back, crying out but trying to remain standing. At that moment, the monster, having noticed the failed attempt, thrust one of its heads forward. It began to form a magic spell near its open mouth. The energy surged, and a powerful attack flew toward Elpam, who stood frozen, staring at it. He couldn't run away. In a low voice, he said it was a pitiful sight. He didn't understand why it had to end like this. He assumed that if only he had more power, things would have turned out differently. If he could have started over, he would have done everything another way. Suddenly, he was distracted from his thoughts by someone calling out to him and throwing water on him, ordering him to get up. Abruptly opening his eyes, the main character froze in shock. Lowering his head, he opened his mouth slightly and looked ahead in amazement. The man in front of him shouted that he knew Elpam was healthy and called him another name, adding that he was a stupid decoy slave. He ordered him not to forget his place, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked coldly at Elpam. Cursing inwardly, the protagonist asked himself, "Where's the Horntail?" Then, suddenly, he told himself to stop and asked again, "Is he still alive?" As he continued to stare in amazement at the man in front of him, he told himself to stop again. When he looked around, he noticed several other men standing to the side, their hands shackled like his own. Elpam suddenly recognized the place, and because he was deep in thought, he barely heard some people talking nearby. They were discussing the new product they had brought. Others praised their companions for their excellent choice for a long trip to the dungeons. The main character, after moving his wrist slightly, realized that he was already here once again. As if from a distance, he heard someone thank their interlocutor, and another person confidently announced that the buyer couldn't find a better place anywhere else. Some people, looking at those behind the bars, suggested taking one of them. Someone asked what price they would pay for the chosen person. Merchants praised their customers for their excellent taste. Elpam, still looking around, finally exclaimed mentally that this was a slave market. Lowering his head, he began to breathe heavily, assuming that this was nonsense. Slave markets had been banned for a very long time. However, he was completely sure that this was indeed the right place. Refocusing on the man who had earlier disdainfully remarked how funny it was that he managed to survive and return alone, the main character recalled that, if he remembered correctly, it was this merchant who had bought him in the market 6 years ago when Elpam himself was already a slave. Still silent, he stared carefully at the slaver and finally realized it was indeed the same man. In this case, it could be said that he had actually gone back in time. At that moment, the man frowned, called him a degrading name, clenched his hand into a fist, and swung to strike. Noticing this, Elpam's eyes widened. The man angrily asked, "What are you looking at?" then cursed as he threw the punch. The main character, stunned, looked at the incoming fist in surprise but couldn't react in time. He realized that this was the day he had returned to, the moment when it all started. When the man hit him in the face, Elpam lowered his head and asked himself if he was dreaming. However, he quickly rejected the idea. The sensations were too real to be a fantasy. It didn't make sense, but he couldn't find any other explanation. At that moment, the merchant stepped closer, showing Walker and his team of slave lures what he had to offer. He hoped there would be a suitable item for them. Pointing to Elpam and another slave, he announced that he had just received them. Walker decided to take them. The main character, watching him, realized there was nothing to even think about. Frowning mentally, he said to himself that he had been given a second chance. At the moment when all his team members were destroyed by monsters and the immediate danger had passed, Elpam understood. He picked up the fire arrow staff from the ground and, after carefully inspecting the weapon, mentally noted that it wasn't a bad ability. Slinging the staff over his shoulder, he decided it would be perfect for now. Pressing his lips together, he looked around again, assuming that it still wasn't enough. He was sure that the adventurer group must have brought other things with them if they had planned to gather materials here. Suddenly, he noticed an uneaten leg. As he pulled off the boot, he remembered that some people hide valuable items in their shoes. Inside the boot, he found a ring. Surprised by this, he still put the jewelry on his finger. In the next instant, the ring glowed, shrouded in magical energy. The protagonist realized that it was a telekinesis ring, but he was suddenly distracted when he heard a sharp sound from the side. With a wary frown, he whirled around to see monsters running toward him. There were many enemies. Elpam, holding his spear at the ready, assumed they had come because of the smell of blood. One of the monsters rushed closer and threw a punch, sending dust and stone shards flying. The other monsters immediately surged forward. Elpam looked around, assessing the danger. With a few swings of his spear, he destroyed some of the nearest monsters. At that moment, another monster coming from the other side took advantage of the chaos. It released a long, winding tongue that wrapped around Elpam's spear. He noticed it, but continued to hold his weapon tightly. The monster jerked its tongue sharply, and the spear broke in half. The main character opened his eyes wide, looking in amazement at the fragments of his weapon falling to the ground. He even opened his mouth slightly in shock. The monster, taking advantage, came closer with its paws and opened its mouth wide to destroy him. However, Elpam managed to get his bearings in time and activated a fire arrow, sending a stream of flames toward the monster closest to him. The attack pierced through the monster. The main character, now more cautious, carefully scanned his opponents. He suggested to himself that he should try using the ring. Before the magic arrow spell dissipated, he swung his hand to control it. The attack suddenly changed direction, impaling several other nearby monsters as well. Finally, when the power of the attack was exhausted, the fire dissolved, and Elpam froze, looking at the flames around him and at the destroyed monsters. He knew he couldn't hold them off for long. In the next instant, breaking through the fire, other monsters that were still intact came closer. As he was preparing for the next attack, the protagonist thought that he couldn't say any of this was truly important, but suddenly he froze, his eyes widening with excitement as he looked at the weapon in his hand. When the monsters ran forward to attack, he had to jump out of the way. He wondered why he couldn't activate the fire arrow. He knew the staff wasn't broken, and he began to suspect it had a cooldown period. He looked at the weapon again, unable to gather any magic around it, and had to dodge once more as the monsters regained their bearings and resumed their attack. When he found a moment to steady himself, he shifted into a more stable position and swung the staff like a club. The blow was powerful, and the monster flew slightly to the side. Elpam realized he had no choice. He swung the staff a few more times, striking the monster again. When it was disoriented, he kicked it, sending it crashing to the ground. The main character looked at the staff again and asked aloud if it was ready now. The weapon was in fact glowing with magical energy. Noticing several more monsters rushing toward him, Elpam thought, "Good," and frowned in concentration. He shot a powerful fire arrow in their direction. Undeterred, the monsters kept charging forward. The main character, deciding to repeat the trick, waved his hand and activated the telekinesis ring. Controlling the magical arrow, he made it fly in a zigzag, destroying all the nearby monsters. He watched his opponents seriously, lips pursed tightly, and when the battle was over, he stood silently, looking at the corpses around him. Suddenly, Charlotte raised her head and, stammering in shock, exclaimed that he was no ordinary decoy slave. Elpam turned at the sound of her voice, surprised she was still alive. Charlotte clenched her jaw, closed one eye but kept the other open, watching the main character's fighting ability and magic. She asked who he was. She cursed softly, and he called her lucky, though he quickly decided to take it back. Charlotte opened her other eye and asked why he was so strong. Then she noticed he was holding the staff that had previously belonged to Walker. She also saw that a glowing band had appeared around Elpam's wrist. She couldn't understand how a decoy slave could awaken such powers. Since the main character didn't respond, she suddenly asked him to wait and begged him not to mention that the anomaly was due to him. Elpam, still silent, frowned and pressed his lips together. Charlotte was quiet for a moment as well. Finally, the protagonist asked if she was finished speaking. She flinched at the sound of his voice and looked at him with a puzzled expression, trying to sit up for a better view. Elpam confessed that he was afraid she was wrong. In his opinion, it didn't even matter if the others were still alive, because he was going to kill Charlotte anyway. She frowned and asked, "What is this nonsense?" Clenching her jaw, she looked at the main character seriously. He replied that she had used people as bait in order to survive. Sweat trickled down Charlotte's face from exhaustion, and she opened her eyes wide in horror. Elpam, activating fire magic, pointed his staff at Charlotte and looked at her coldly, warning her that he despised people like her. Sometime later in the city, people were asking in shock, "What is this nonsense?" Their eyes widened, unable to control their astonishment. They asked, "Is this really true?" Their faces were drenched in sweat from exertion, their mouths open in disbelief. They couldn't hide their emotions. Elpam walked calmly past them on the street. People continued to shout in amazement, saying this couldn't be happening. They couldn't believe that the decoy slave had returned alive and alone. Ignoring the startled stares directed at him, the protagonist walked forward with a frown, mentally noting that the die had been cast. He knew he had to act quickly to avoid repeating the same fate. Still, he decided to do everything in the correct order. He stopped in front of a tall building and looked up at it, deciding it was time to get rid of his slave status. Later, adventurers passed by the same building more calmly, shifting their attention away from Elpam. Inside the building, a bees was sitting at a table in an office and asked if it was true that the slave had returned alive. The man in front of him, who had delivered the news, confirmed that it was true. He added seriously, with a frown, that according to reports from others, the main character had come back completely unharmed. Abiz scoffed and said, "What's the big deal?" He assumed that the return of the decoy slave unharmed was nothing extraordinary and tapped the ash from his cigar into a special ashtray. The young man told him that all the adventurers on Elpam's team had died in the game. Abiz paused, then asked him to wait. "Do you mean he survived alone?" he asked, frowning. He realized that this was all very strange and was surprised that the main character had decided to submit a report instead of running away. Those who were enslaved because of huge debts could not escape the fate of being used as bait again. If Elpam didn't try to escape, it meant he understood how difficult it would be. After all, death was the only path to freedom for such decoy slaves. Abbés and his collaborator introduced a slave running from a monster, alongside a large number of skulls stacked on top of each other. Interlacing the fingers of his hands, Abbés thought for a while and finally understood how things really were. He said that this was how things were done in their Gaport trade guild. He asked if it was really necessary to report such details to him. Closing his eyes, he added that there was something else he needed to know. He had been informed that this slave had awakened the first circle. The words made Abbés freeze, startled, his eyes widening as he asked, "What did you just say?" He was shocked by the fact that a decoy slave had a circle. Taking another drag on his cigarette, he thought that this man must have a very low opinion of their guilt. If he was a slave, Abbés frowned in concentration, wondering what kind of person he might be. He was suddenly distracted from his thoughts when the man said that other employees had told him Elpam was asking for a change in his contract. Paying particular attention to the word contract, Abbés asked again, surprised, and his subordinate confirmed that it was indeed true. He explained that the main character wanted to register as an adventurer. Abbés was even more surprised and cursed, asking, "Who does Elpam think he is?" The man leaned his hand on his chest and bowed his head, saying that he was Lin and wanted Abbés to handle this situation personally. Rising abruptly, Abbés leaned forward, placing his hands on the table and asked, "Is this Lauren's wish?" Imagining the man's silhouette, he wondered why the guild's executive head would be interested in a slave. Unable to find an answer, he froze, bowed his head, clenched his jaw, frowned, and told himself to stop. Is this what he's thinking? Sometime later, the man who had delivered the news left the office, closing the door behind him. Abbés left the lit cigar smoldering next to the ashtray, walked to the tall window, looked out through the glass, and thought about the slave who wanted to become an adventurer. In the name of Emperor Seenness, slavery had been abolished, but only conditionally, because people were still slaves to Mezos, climbing on each other's backs and stretching out their palms toward gold coins. Those who failed to pay their loans on time were required to work them off. This simple law introduced non-caste slaves into the Maple world. When Elpam's father, the only family he had, died of illness, Elpam became one of these slaves. He had stood in line with other similar debtors, chained and with his head bowed in submission. He had bought an ingredient called black moss from the Gaport Merchant Guild to try and cure his father, promising to pay the money later. He remembered the bag filled with the required material and mentally noted that the guild had demanded 1,000,000 mesos, several times the market price. Sometime later, when Elpam appeared at the trial, the judge called his name and announced that he had failed to repay the guild on time. The protagonist raised his head, eyes wide, and looked at the judge, waiting for the verdict. The man frowned and slammed the gavel down on the desk, announcing that Elpam would be required to work for the guild within a set time frame. The main character froze upon hearing this and thought that, for 6 years, these people had exploited him. However, he now assumed it was time for revenge. Sometime after that, he was sitting across a table from Abbés. Cups of a hot drink were placed before them, and Elpam introduced himself, saying he was ready to help. In his mind's eye, he wondered if this was the same Abbés he had heard of, a loyal servant of Lin, one of the guild's executive heads. He supposed that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Abbés closed his eyes and raised his cup to his lips. "I've heard you want to make changes to your contract," he said. Taking a sip, he added, "Let's get straight to the point. Others have already told me enough about you." Setting his cup aside, he gravely promised to register Elpam as an F-rank adventurer. Elpam was surprised that he had accepted the offer so easily. He smiled and thanked him, wondering what the reason for such quick approval could be. However, he wanted to add something else. When Abbés heard him begin to speak again, he narrowed his eyes warily, watching him closely. Elpam smiled and said that he was requesting an E rank. He had decided that this game wouldn't be played by Abbés's rules. Leaning back and crossing his arms over his chest, Abbés asked, "Is the main character asking for E rank?" He pointed out that Elpam wasn't even officially recognized by the Adventurers Guild yet. The association listened as Elpam said that he had passed through the gate as bait hundreds of times over the past 3 years. Not about to deny this fact, Abius admitted that it was true, but added that Elpam was doing it only as bait and was still new to killing monsters. The main character, not willing to give up, retorted and asked, "Since when are adventurers judged by their ability to hunt monsters?" Abiz, not expecting such words, asked again, reminding him that the first adventurer had earned great fame through his battle skills. He pictured an armed man standing on top of a defeated dragon. Elpam frowned and announced that the ultimate goal of any adventurer was to return alive from their journey. Leaning forward slightly and placing his hand on the table, Abias thought that this was true because the information a survivor could bring back was more valuable than battle merit. Aloud, he said that it was reasonable, and he honestly admitted that the fact that the main character had survived and returned a large number of times as a decoy was a great achievement. Reaching into the inner pocket of his robe, he added that that was all, and declared that bait-class adventurers were only allowed at lower-level gates. He asked if Elpam really believed that his paltry survival skills would save him in a high-level gate. Taking out a cigarette case, he pulled out a cigar, noting that Elpam was very much mistaken if he thought the guild members were credulous enough to sign a contract with a cocky idiot. He mentally called the main character names, then lit the cigar, inhaled the smoke, and thought if he continues to overestimate himself, he will die very soon. Elpam just closed his eyes, saying nothing. Abiz, watching him closely, thought that his intuition was telling him something about this man. Finally, the main character opened his eyes but remained silent. Abiz told him there was a gate with a limit of 5 people and 12 marks on the trunk. Hearing him speak, Elpam looked up, focusing on him, and Abiz, assuming that he understood what his words meant, confirmed it and said that it meant at least 12 groups of 5 people had gone into the dungeon and never returned. After explaining this, he ordered Elpam to prove that he was worthy of the rank he was asking for. After listening to the conditions, the protagonist stubbornly frowned, looking seriously at the other party, who promised that he would grant his wish if he could manage it. Smiling, he held out his hand, which was holding the contract. Sometime later in the forest, a man named Chev stepped forward a little, smiled at Elpam, and confessed that he was glad to meet her. He introduced himself and said that he was the tank in their team. He also added that Abias had told him about the main character working as a decoy slave, but asked Elpam not to worry about it. He admitted that he didn't care, and pointing behind him at his comrades Max, Tom, and Ro, he said that they wouldn't pay attention to it either. The guys behind him smiled and greeted Elpam. He kept his face neutral and simply said that he was pleased to meet them. Chev added that he had heard Elpam could use fire magic. Elpam confirmed that this was indeed the case. Max grinned, stepped closer, and asked, "Isn't every magic available to mages?" Chev explained that this was not the case. Mages can only control the element they are predisposed to from birth. That's why it was useless for them to take an item that didn't match their element. After saying that, Chev asked if Max had never heard of it. Max admitted that it was very difficult to understand. Chev, realizing that he was getting off topic, suggested that Elpam already knew their goal on this mission was not to hunt monsters. Max confirmed this with a smile, and Chev continued, explaining that they needed to retrieve items dropped by the other 12 teams who had gone in before them. That should have been the end of their work. Still smiling, he explained that the guild was willing to pay 3,000 mesos for each item. Suddenly interrupting the speech, Max closed his eyes, frowned, waved his hand, and announced with displeasure that this was daylight robbery, since the guild members would have been left without the items at all if not for them. In addition, those adventurers had 1 circle each, which meant that their items were worth at least 7,000. He sighed in disgust, but Tom ordered him to stop complaining. Max, after being asked again, declared that he hadn't complained. However, someone suddenly interrupted their quarrel and asked if everyone was ready. The team members decided that the time to earn money had come, and they all entered the portal, starting to look around. The other world was shrouded in fog. Max clenched his jaw and then, a little contemptuously, said that it was light but still creepy. Chev, drawing the others' attention to him, asked them to listen and explained that it was very likely the task would be delayed, judging by the terrain, therefore they needed to set up camp. Someone suggested setting it up at the top of a tree, since there were many branches to hide behind and it would be easier to find a better place from above. Chev agreed that this was a good idea and suggested they do just that. It wasn't long before they got the necessary tools to build the shelter. Max stepped closer to the main character, put his hand on his shoulder, and told him that he could rest for now. Pointing to Tom, who was kneeling down and already starting preparations, he said that they were going to handle it from here. The two of them were experts in construction. Elpam didn't argue, and after a while Max and Tom built a wooden platform around the tree for shelter. Now that everything was ready, they decided to split up into two groups and explore the area. Chev said that Tom, Max, and Roa would go together while he and Elpam would check the west side. The others would check the east side. He also warned them to give the signal immediately and return quickly to the base if something happened. When he asked if the others agreed, they said they understood. Soon Elpam and Chev were moving in the right direction, scanning the area. After a certain amount of time passed, Chev cautiously announced with a frown that there weren't any monsters here. He assumed that they had set up camp too close to the entrance. He decided they would go deeper into the forest tomorrow and asked how the main character was doing on his first assignment as an adventurer. Elpam was silent for a moment. His eyes narrowed slightly and his lips pressed together more tightly. Then he admitted that he was nervous. Chev laughed and said he understood. He admitted that he was still worried every time he entered the gate, even though he had already gained some experience. He noted that he wasn't the bravest person in the world, but added that he continued to boldly take a step forward because he was surrounded by people who were important to him. He didn't know how it sounded from the outside, but he said that all his comrades were really good people. He admitted that he had felt very sorry when he first heard the main character's story. He couldn't even imagine how hard it must have been for Elpam to be a decoy slave. He added that if Elpam wanted to, he could join their team permanently. He smiled enthusiastically as he said this, but suddenly froze, letting out a startled sigh when he noticed that the main character was standing to the side, not reacting to his words in any way. He laughed nervously and asked him not to take his words too seriously, but Elpam didn't say anything. Sometime later, the team gathered around the campfire and started discussing what had happened. Someone said that it wasn't very good after learning that the others didn't find anything either. Tom reminded them that they had known this just wouldn't be easy. Chev asked if they could avoid talking about work at least while eating. While the others were talking, Elpam remained silent. His lips tightened and his head lowered. Unlike the others, he did not eat but took a sip from the flask he held in his hands. A little later, when the moon was high, there was a scraping sound on the wooden platform they had constructed. One of the crew members, holding a torch, came closer to Elpam, who had covered his head with a blanket, and called his name, trying to get his attention. It was Chev, who asked with a serious frown if the main character was asleep. There was silence for a while. No one said anything. Then someone came up to Chev, put a hand on his shoulder, and asked what the matter was. It was Max, who, with his dagger ready, gravely announced that they all knew Elpam had fallen asleep too quickly to answer. Chev grinned at that, and Max said he was being too careful. He asked if Chev had already forgotten what they had put in Elpam's dinner. He was sure that the substance was powerful enough to put a giant meddler to sleep, and Elpam had eaten every bit of it. He laughed, pointing out that they could get at least 10,000 mesos for his fire arrow staff. As he got closer to the main character, he held up his dagger, grinning, and shouted that it was time to get down to business. He then abruptly lowered the dagger, plunging it into the blanket and the body beneath it. But he froze in surprise when he heard a sound that was not at all characteristic of cutting flesh. Opening his eyes wider, he asked in bewilderment, "What is this?" Yanking off the blanket, he saw that it wasn't a human body underneath, but a log with pillows tied to it in the right places to create the necessary volume. The team members shouted in horror that Elpam wasn't there and asked what that meant. They couldn't believe it and asked how it had happened. They were all equally surprised, and after controlling their emotions, Chev frowned and ordered his companions to find the main character, since he had to be somewhere nearby. But before the adventurers could do anything, a powerful fire attack flew into their platform. The resulting explosion destroyed part of the wooden structure, causing Chev to jump out of the way. The fire instantly spread through the tree, cutting off all escape routes. The team members shouted in horror that it was fire. Elpam, perched on the branch of a nearby tree, was just watching them. Tom asked what this nonsense was. Chev didn't know either, so he simply ordered everyone to save the food and other valuables as soon as possible, Tom said. Not immediately following the order, he asked if Elpam had done it. Then he froze, drawing Chev's attention. His mouth opened slightly in surprise, his eyes widening as he pointed to the side. Chev turned, frowning in annoyance, and asked what else he wanted. However, his annoyance quickly turned to amazement. And he too froze as he noticed a large monster that had approached their burning hideout. Beads of sweat broke out on his face, and in an attempt to deny everything he was seeing, he called out the main character's name, cursing him. The monster suddenly opened its mouth to devour the adventurers, and they realized with horror that Elpam had used them as bait to lure the monster out. When they reached the edge of the platform, they jumped down with a cry, and in the next instant, the tree they had used as shelter was swallowed up by the monster. Without taking time to assess the extent of the damage, the team members began to run. Elpam, sitting in a nearby tree, continued to watch them. He thought the Chev actor was terrible, noting that he didn't need to show any kindness if he wanted to deceive him. Immediately, he remembered that this gate had already killed 12 teams. The members of this team had welcomed the former decoy, not someone with a lot of experience, with open arms. It was all very obvious to him. As he continued to ponder, he looked at the terrified faces of the team members who were running and panting from exhaustion. He guessed that this monster was the boss of the dungeon and turned his attention toward it. The monster quickly moved forward, chasing the team members, and its huge body destroyed the trees it crawled past. Shiv turned around for a second, cursing and shouting that this was the worst type of monster for them. Tom, drawing attention to himself, asked if Chev knew anything about the monster. He replied that if he wasn't mistaken, it was a golden slime mold and that its body was made of acid, making it the worst enemy for them in close combat. However, that wasn't all. While looking at the small pools of slime left behind where the monster crawled, Chev frowned. But before he could continue explaining, he suddenly noticed the monster attacking them and warned his team members to be careful, pushing them out of harm's way. When the effect of the attack wore off, Tom, who had been removed from the range by Chev, cursed in horror as the slime shot at them again. Chev, reaching out in Tom's direction, frowned and breathed heavily. The team members were terrified by the realization that the monster could also attack from a distance. Chev, approaching the melted part of the ground filled with acid, explained that it was an acid arrow, an ability that shoots acid. Sweat broke out on Tom's face from exertion, and he scowled furiously, shouting that it wasn't fair. However, to distract him from his outrage, Chev ordered him and the rest of the team not to panic, as the monster was coming again. Looking at the approaching monster, someone asked what they should do. The team began to wonder how they could defeat it. At first, they decided to get out of the attack radius. Since the acid arrow's cooldown time was 1 minute, they had to form a battle formation and destroy the core located in the center of the monster's head. Suddenly frowning and grinning, Max thought about reloading, then stopped abruptly, turning around and running toward the monster. Seeing this, the other team members also stopped, shouting his name in shock. He asked what they were waiting for and shouted that he would kill the monster right now. When he got within range, he jumped up, readying his dagger to attack. Chev held out his hand and asked him to wait, warning him that they needed to work together. Then suddenly, the monster fired another acid arrow and pointed it at Max, its body sliced in half. Max opened his mouth in surprise and Chev frowned, asking in horror, "What is this?" He recalled the cooldown time, exclaiming that Max still had 10 seconds left. At that moment, the monster focused on them again and launched another acid arrow. When it crashed into an obstacle, it exploded, sending additional acid splashes to the sides. Dust and shards of rock rose up around them, and in the acid directed by the monster, the bodies of the remaining team members quickly dissolved, leaving only skeletons. When the monster had finished with them, it froze and looked around. Elpam, who had finally come down from the tree, made a mental note that Shave and his team were finished. Pressing his lips tighter, he thought that Shave had been right in theory, but the golden slime mold got stronger with each item it consumed. So, it was to be expected that the cooldown time might have decreased. He noticed the team members' weapons dissolving in acid and wondered about the monster's unpredictable growth and its ability to launch acid arrows without reloading. He assumed he now understood why the previous teams had died. Noting that this monster was out of their league, he carefully watched it move on, knowing that in this state it would be able to hold out even in this yellow gate, which was 2 levels below the red one. He doubted that a single circle adventurer would be able to defeat this monster. As he watched the monster begin to move again, he remained alert. Away, leaving an acid-corroded track in its wake, he also realized that no items could be returned from this gate. As he turned around, he mentally noted that the task was over. He remembered Biz had asked him to prove that he could possess an A rank, and he smiled faintly. Suddenly the monster stopped, looked to the side, and then narrowed its eyes suspiciously, not understanding what was happening around it. But before the monster could discover the source of the threat, a powerful fire attack flew in from the side, causing the acid that made up the monster to spray outwards. The monster screamed, opening its mouth wide, and the acid droplets flying from it corroded the ground. As the attack dissipated, the wound the monster had received instantly healed, replenishing with acid, but it still growled as one of its eyes was destroyed. Elpam, who had stopped in a tree to watch his opponent, said in a low voice that he was aiming for the core, but noticed that the monster had impressive magic resistance. He knew it would take at least 4 more shots, but immediately corrected himself, deciding that, to defeat the monster, it would take 5 shots. He looked at the leaking liquid that made up the monster's eye, as well as the small plumes of smoke rising from the impact site. It couldn't be said that this would be a problem. With a smile, the protagonist announced that he didn't mind getting proof. The monster, noticing him, focused its attention on him, sending a large number of acid volleys in his direction. Elpam was standing on a tree branch until the last moment, and only when the attack was dangerously close did he jump out of the way, allowing the acid to crash into the tree. The monster continuously fired more acid arrows, but the protagonist managed to dodge each of them. He used the dagger and the rope tied to it to keep himself in the air. After pulling the weapon out of its scabbard, he threw it up, waiting for the blade to dig into the wood. As the next attack flew dangerously close to him, he sighed, frowning in annoyance and clenching his jaw. Focusing on the dagger, he activated the telekinesis ring, driving the dagger into the right place. He knew every shot had to hit the same spot, noting that this was something a simple mage could only dream of. However, he was not a simple magician. In his previous life, he was known as the greatest telekinetic. Now, using the rope to stay in the air while dodging the acid arrows, he held out the fire arrow staff, directing the flames towards the monster. After pulling the fire string that appeared, he released a fire arrow forward. The powerful attack hit right on target, wounding the monster again. From how strong the impact was, the monster even fell to its side. Elpam mentally counted down 4 more attacks, and at that moment the monster, though fallen, sent another attack at him. The main character managed to avoid this by running a little higher up the tree trunk. When the acid arrow hit the tree trunk, he looked at it, then, after waiting for the staff to recharge, he activated the fire arrow again while using telekinesis at the same time. The next attack hit exactly where it should, and Elpam made a mental note that there were 3 more hits left. The monster opened its mouth wide, screamed, and began to shoot more acid arrows, but the main character managed to dodge each attack, turning over in the air so it was easier to attack. He launched the fire arrow again, aiming it at the right place. When the fire exploded, dealing damage to the monster, he flew to the side, thinking there were 2 more attacks left. The monster, disoriented, did not have time to direct any attacks at him. Elpam again used a fire arrow, directing it to where it was needed. This time, the monster removed its slime from the place where the attack flew. The main character noticed that it was dodging and thought the monster was quite agile for its size. When he reached the trunk of one of the trees, he pushed off from it to increase his speed and at the same time swung his hand, controlling the fire arrow he shot. He thought it was useless and sent an attack at the monster from behind. The monster didn't expect this and growled, opening its eyes wider. In the next instant, the attack collided with it and exploded, dealing even more damage. This time, the core in the center of the monster was exposed and cracked from the force of the impact. Elpam moved closer, taking advantage of the fact that the monster had not yet covered the core with slime. As he raised his staff, he began to concentrate energy next to it to deliver the next blow. With a frown, he announced that this was the end. The monster turned the remaining slime into a hand and raised it to stop the main character, but he ignored it and continued moving towards the target to destroy the core. Abruptly lowering the slime arm, the monster pointed it at Elpam. He turned around, frowning, activating his telekinesis. He began to control the dagger and the rope tied to it, abruptly yanking himself away from where he had been hanging in the air before. He managed to dodge the attack, and the hand lowered by the monster hit the ground. The main character himself successfully landed immediately. Activating a fire arrow and pointing the staff at the enemy, Elpam launched the attack to the side. He noticed that the monster itself was holding out its arm in front of it, hoping to defend itself. However, smiling, Elpam used telekinesis to redirect the attack at the last second before it would have crashed into the monster's arm. After passing the obstacle, the attack struck the monster's main body, and the exploding fire finally destroyed the core inside the monster. The remaining slime began to churn and swell violently, and the monster growled one last time, surprised at what was happening. In the next instant, the body of the monster exploded. Elpam ran to the side, dodging rocks and slime flying in different directions. He managed to reach a safe distance before the first wave of slime reached him. After catching the dagger, he threw it sharply to the side, adding speed and refining the direction with telekinesis. Wrapping the rope around a tree branch, he used it to climb up and get out of the way of the slime flow, which was moving forward at high speed. With a small smile, he looked at the river of slime that was uprooting the trees. After a certain amount of time had passed, the slime began to evaporate. Smoke rose into the air, and Elpam, satisfied that the ground was now safe, sank down calmly, walking between the remaining small pools of acid. Finally, he stopped, noticing what he was looking for. Using his telekinesis, he picked up a rock that had fallen from the monster. Abruptly, the rock broke free of the mud and flew up, coming to rest near Elpam's hand. He frowned as he looked at it carefully. The stone began to emit light, and while raising his palm higher, the protagonist watched as the energy from the stone spread, becoming a dome around him. After a while, he announced that he was back and sat down in the chair opposite Abiz. He sat with his arms crossed, frowning earnestly at him. Then, Abiz realized that Elpam could do more than talk. However, he was surprised by the fact that Elpam had once again returned alone and without the items he was supposed to bring back. The main character said that the team he was assigned to consisted of absolute beginners who had tried to kill him in order to take his item. Closing his eyes, he assumed that they had met a boss monster and all of them had died running away from it. Frowning, Abiz asked if Elpam had seen the monster. Confirming this, Elpam revealed that it was a golden slime mold. Startled, Abiz asked again, guessing what had exactly happened to all the items left over from past adventurers. The main character, understanding Abiz's assumption, confirmed that all these objects were corroded by acid. Frowning in annoyance, Abiz couldn't even believe that the guild had lost all the items loaned to those adventurers. He knew this was a huge loss. As he took a closer look at Elpam, he mentally noted that the fact Elpam was back was another problem. The main character continued to sit calmly across from him, and Abiz thought that several universal rules applied to all gates. First, each gate has its own limit on the number of people entering, and this was indicated on the trunk before entering. When the limit was reached, the gate was deactivated until all the people who entered died. Second, there was a limit on which adventurers could enter a gate of a certain color. The difficulty ranged from red to purple. If the adventurer's rank was higher than the allowed one, then they would not be able to enter the gate. Third, adventurers were only given one chance to clear the gate. This was the main difficulty associated with capturing the gate. As soon as someone came out of the gate alive, it immediately disappeared and no one else could enter it. The only other option was when all the team members died in the gate would disappear. Abiz honestly admitted to himself that the golden slime mold was too powerful a monster for single circle adventurers. Finally, he realized how things really were and said that Elpam had barely managed to get out of there. He realized this explained why Elpam hadn't returned any of the items, since all of those items had obviously been destroyed. However, whatever the reason, he declared that the main character had failed, but he tightened his lips and warned him not to jump to conclusions as he hadn't finished yet. Abiz raised one eyebrow at the question, and Elpam explained that he had actually done something else. He untied the rope that held the special bracers around his wrists. Noticing what was hidden under the leather bandage, Abiz exclaimed in amazement that it couldn't be. The protagonist showed a second line that appeared around his wrist, grinning and announcing that he had swallowed a golden slug. Abiz, still in shock, cried out and asked, "Does Elpam have two laps?" He asked if Elpam absorbed the mana stone dropped from the monster. The main character suggested that this proved his abilities perfectly for Abiz and announced that he now wanted him to register as an E-rank adventurer. After coming down, Abiz looked at him and then said that he would register him as a D-rank adventurer. Elpam was shocked. His eyes widened as he asked what the other man had just said. He even opened his mouth in surprise, and Abiz abruptly Moving closer to him, Abias frowned, then smiled broadly and shouted that he would register him at D rank. He also added that if the main character agreed to work exclusively for him, then he would become a C rank adventurer. Without replying, Elpam simply took the documents and signed them. Abias puffed on his cigar, watching him carefully, and thought that C rank was too high for an adventurer without a third circle because the ranks of adventurers were strongly linked to the number of circles. Beginner adventurers ranged from A to F rank, junior adventurers from D to C rank, and meritorious adventurers from B to A rank. In this world, power corresponding to the number of circles varied greatly, but Elpam, as far as Ablis was concerned, was clearly an exception. He knew that not everyone could gain a circle by using a mana stone. As he looked at the protagonist's focused face, he mentally noted that Elpam also had an instinct for self-preservation. He remembered the way Elpam had looked at him with a frown before and smiled again, noting that his instinct for self-preservation was far superior to that of the adventurers he knew. Elpam earned a second circle in the blink of an eye right after the first, and Ablis thought that his speed of development was unheard of. So he decided to hire him. After a while, he sank back into the chair opposite Elpam and continued to smile broadly, eyes closed contentedly, paying close attention to him. The main character was worried but did not say anything. Then, closing his eyes, he sighed, realizing that everything was going better than he expected. He guessed that Ablis must be in desperate need of help, and to be honest, he realized that it would come in handy very soon. He imagined another huge gate, thinking about the first 100-man Red Gate conquest that was about to take place. He remembered that this gate had a limit of 100 participants, and if his memory was correct, it was around this time that a huge event occurred, one that all the merchant and adventurer guilds in the league would be interested in. As he introduced the emblems of the other guilds, he assumed that the Capoeira Guild would definitely be paying attention to this event as well, which wasn't a bad thing since he was also in a hurry. So it wouldn't hurt to speed up his plan a little. When he finally finished filling out the document, he put the pen aside. Then, drawing Abias's attention to himself, he confessed that he wanted to ask him a favor. Abias immediately responded, announcing that he was listening. The main character, holding up his palm, extended it in Abias's direction, and asked him to report the money to him. Abias closed his eyes, smiled a little thoughtfully, and put down his cigarette. But in his mind, he called Elpam and asked himself if he really meant it. Sometime later, the main character thought, while some people claim that the appearance of the enemy gave rise to the era of adventurers, in fact it was a trap set by the dark magician. He imagined the image of a huge man who, by pulling in his palm, formed a bright magic portal that he advanced through. Many adventurers died at the gate, and slowly but surely the Maple world was being stripped of its potential. Then the day of the apocalypse arrived. From the large number of portals located in the sky, a huge number of monsters, as if waiting for this moment, came out of the gate, flooding the world of Maple, and its inhabitants were defeated. The event described was going to happen exactly 3 years from now, which meant that the tragic fate of the Maple world was just around the corner. When Elpam had left, Abias went to the window and looked out, frowning as he held an unlit cigar between his teeth. As he watched the main character walk out of the guild, he put his hand on the bag hanging from his belt and thought that he had a long way to go. But he assumed that this should be enough time to start implementing his plans. The newly found 100-person gate was red in color, meaning that only those with 2 circles or less could enter. Elpam ignored the chattering villagers as he passed them, thinking of the Capoeira Merchant Guild, which usually hired high-ranking adventurers. He recalled the guild's logo, mentally noting that the only reason to invest in it was because the guild bosses had targeted this particular gate. He finally had the money, but he knew that he needed to use it wisely and not spend it all at once. He also realized that truly useful items were too expensive, and he asked himself what would be the most profitable thing to spend the borrowed money on. He paused for a moment, peering at the sign on the gate, and then stood there, fists clenched, deep in thought. Suddenly a man came closer to him, smiled happily, greeted him, and invited him to Reese's job market. The man noticed that Elpam looked like an adventurer and asked if he could help him. Listening to the man's words, the main character looked around, noticing people communicating with each other, choosing slaves imprisoned in special boxes enclosed by bars, while other people were making deals. The man asked what exactly Elam was looking for. He offered him a decoy slave or a partner to fight alongside him, but Elam closed his eyes and shook his head from side to side, declaring that he was looking for a certain person. The merchant raised an eyebrow and asked, "Who exactly are you looking for, Elam?" He wanted the merchant to take him to someone. When the main character expressed his preference, the merchant took him to another room, telling him that there were punitive premises there. Running his hand along the corridor, he explained that the most problematic people were sent to these places for correctional purposes. The one Elam was looking for was one of these men. When they reached the right dungeon, the protagonist and the merchant stopped. The man pointed to the bars and said that they needed to go in. Inside was Deba, whose hands were tied to the floor with a thick chain. He flinched when he saw the customers, and at the sharp sound the merchant, whose face was covered with sweat from exertion, sighed nervously, looking toward the main character. He excitedly asked if he was sure about this. He wanted to explain the reason for his concern, but Elum interrupted him, simply saying that he knew everything. Moving closer to the bars and looking at the displeased expression on Daba's face, Elam confirmed that this was the person he was looking for. Daba's frown only deepened as he looked at him, and Elam thought that the death of one person had precipitated the destruction of Maple's world in his previous life. He recalled a few people, then remembered that the one whose death accelerated the destruction of the world was Erin, the heroine of Halir. He visualized her silhouette, noting that she had been murdered, and that the culprit was none other than her only student. But suddenly the main character was distracted from his thoughts as Daba, twitching, tried to break the chains. He did not succeed. Looking at him more closely, Elam thought that this was the man who murdered Erin, and that this incident had marked the beginning of the end. Daba continued to stare at the protagonist with displeasure, stubbornly pursing his lips. After that he asked if Elam had really come looking for him. Elam said nothing. Deba, noting that they had never met before, ordered the main character to leave and spat on the floor while still looking at him. The merchant, noticing his behavior, looked at Elam with horror and apologized, saying that Deba, whom he called an ignoramus, still needed to learn manners. The main character didn't respond to these nervous apologies, remembering that Deba would earn fame and position in a few years. In the meantime, he was a slave, but still dared to be impertinent to an adventurer who might become his master. He knew that the term impudent didn't fully reflect Deba's character, and noticing his interest in himself, Deba clenched his jaw to show his rage. The merchant, closing his eyes, sighed, saying that Deba was a savage and even a barbarian. The main character smiled, thinking that he was right, not in vain, because Deba, after all, would become the most influential person after Elam himself when the apocalypse happened. He imagined them standing back to back and remembered that people often compared them, because they came from the same region and had so much in common from the time they awakened their powers to how strong they became. However, the main similarity was different, and when Elam made his decision, the merchant released Deba from the cage, removing the chains from him. The main character then asked what price he was at. Stretching his shoulders, Deba chuckled and suggested that Elam must be from a rich family. He asked if he was sure he could afford to buy him. Frowning, he said that he needed 1,000,000 moes, and while calling the main character names, he asked if it was too much for him. Elam thought that they were both desperate for money, since Daba's younger sister was suffering from the black blood plague. He pictured the girl's silhouette, Deba, with one eye squeezed shut and his jaw clenched in exasperation, ordered Elam to leave if he didn't have any money. However, Elam reached into the bag on his belt and took out the bills. Deba opened his eyes wide and asked, "What are these?" Elam waved the money slightly, and Deba stammered a little as he asked, "Is there really 1,000,000 here?" He doubted the money was real and asked if it was even possible. The merchant was as surprised as Deba and asked if Elam was sure of his decision. Deba tightened his lips and let out a nervous sigh, while the protagonist closed his eyes and announced that Deba was getting excited too early. He wasn't finished yet. He demanded a 1-year contract, with a 7-3 profit split, as well as the transfer of all items obtained in the gate to him. The merchant's eyes widened at this, wondering if Elam was trying to hire Deba as a team member instead of a slave. After handing Dubba the contract, the protagonist told him to read the terms carefully. Dubba abruptly grabbed the documents and asked that Elpam not take back his words. He put his finger in his mouth, bit it until blood flowed, and then pressed it to the document, leaving a signature. The main character was surprised that Dubba didn't even hesitate and assumed that he was in a hurry to take care of his little sister. This made him smile. And since the contract was signed, he offered to go straight to the gate. Clutching the document in his hands, Dubba enthusiastically admitted that he had been waiting for Elpam to say this. The latter, after looking at him seriously, warned him that he needed to prove it. Dubba resolutely declared that he was the most agile of those who had met the main character. Sometime later they came to the forest trying to find the gate, and Dubba called out to Elpam a little awkwardly, drawing his attention. He admitted that he liked the new weapon but noted that he felt more confident with the longsword. He asked if he needed to learn something he had more experience with. Elpam frowned at him gravely and announced that he would only use the Helir while working with him. He also added that they could terminate the contract if Dubba was against it. Dubba just sighed but didn't resist anymore and asked if they would train in this gate. His question was related to the fact that they had already arrived at the red gate, marked with a single sigil and a limit of 8 people. Elpam assumed that this gate would work and, starting to look around in surprise, asked, "What about the other team members?" Dubba was sure that the main character had enough money to hire other contestants, so he asked if there would be a healer with them. He had assumed that such a participant would be very important, but he suddenly stopped talking, noticing that Elpam was just looking at him seriously. Stammering a little, he asked why he was looking at him like that. Even before the main character answered, Dubba roughly guessed what was going to happen. After asking him to stop, he frowned and asked him not to say that it would really be as he thought. Elpam calmed him down, told him not to worry, and assured him that they had enough men on their team to clear the gate. Closing his eyes, Dubba smiled with a sigh of relief and admitted that the main character had scared him. Elpam waved his hand and announced that he and Dubba would be the only team members. Dubba froze, even opening his mouth in surprise, and looked at Elpam in shock. He asked again, and then, frowning, asked if this was really a joke. The main character ordered him to stop wasting time and go. Without answering Dubba's question, he just pushed him into the portal. Dubba screamed in surprise, reaching out his hand, and was soon transported to another world. Elpam followed and noticed that Dubba, unable to stand on his feet, had fallen to the ground, kicking up clouds of dust. Dubba screamed and then, furiously frowning, turned toward the main character and asked if he was crazy. He was wondering what they could do together in a gate designed for 8 people, and asked, "Where is the serious approach of Elpam to business?" He called him by name, remarking that he had first forced him to take a weapon he wasn't used to, but he didn't have time to continue his indignant speech and calm down when he noticed that Elpam was looking at him seriously but didn't say anything. Suddenly, Dubba clenched his jaw as he heard a loud noise off to the side. When he turned around, he noticed a huge cloud of dust and clenched his jaw in fright. As he peered, he noticed stumps moving through the dust approaching them and assumed that his shout had attracted the monsters. As he got into a fighting position, he remembered that these monsters were known for their resistance to bladed weapons, but there were a whole bunch of them. Suddenly Elpam passed by and ordered him to step aside. Dubba, looking at him in shock, tried to stop him, asking him to wait. Elpam ignored his words and stepped forward, firing a fire arrow. It went through one of the monsters, destroying it. Dubba's eyes widened as he asked, "What is this?" Meanwhile, the main character, using telekinesis, began to control the arrow, destroying other monsters with it. He continued using the power of the magic attack until it ran out. The monsters were falling to the ground as they burned. Elpam admitted that it was very unfortunate that Dubba had started screaming as soon as he entered the gate. Dubba flinched, frowning, and the main character warned him not to make such a mistake again. He turned around, giving him a serious look. Dubba didn't answer but cursed inwardly and asked himself, "Who is Elpam?" Sometime later, in a building located in Maple World, someone said that the Merchant Guild had taken the bait. Dropping to one knee, the girl closed her eyes and said that they were planning an implementation schedule and that their people were already among them. The man holding a glass of wine didn't say anything. The girl asked if he would allow them to proceed with the plan. Turning around, he looked at her, allowing her to begin the operation. The girl bowed her head lower and then disappeared into black smoke. The man remained silent, looking thoughtfully at his drink, and then raising the glass, announced that it would be the will of the person he was thinking of. With a serious frown, he promised that they would liberate the world of Maple. While the monsters destroyed by the main character were still burning down, Deba collected all the mana stones in a small bag and counted that it was enough. Turning around, Elpam told him to go and headed in the right direction. This time Deba didn't argue and simply agreed. They walked for a while in the sunlit canyon, and Deba thought about everything. He had thought the main character was just an ordinary man, but it turned out that he was an amazing person. Remembering how Elpam had acted earlier, he wondered if it was really telekinesis. He had never heard of such an application of the fire arrow. He realized that if he traveled with the main character, he would definitely earn a large amount of money because he would get 30% of the income, and this would cover the cost of treating his sister. He started to think about what might happen next and smiled happily, but suddenly Elpam stopped, saying that someone was here. Deba, still smiling, looked at him quizzically, and Elpam said that there were still a large number of stump monsters nearby. Peeking out from behind the cliff, Deba looked at the monsters, thinking there were 8, but when he looked more closely he realized he was mistaken and said, "No, it's 9. Elpam confirmed, "That's the right number." Deba, frowning in bewilderment, looked at him and asked what he meant. Elpam just gave him a serious look in return, without explaining anything. Beads of sweat appeared on Deba's face from exertion as he continued to stare at the protagonist in disbelief. After a while they threw a small rock closer to the monsters, and the stumps who had been sleeping opened their eyes, paying attention to the sound. Deba leaped out of cover and swung his halir to attack the monsters from above. With one powerful blow he cut a tree stump in half. The monster didn't even have time to react, but the others, having heard the sharp sound and seen what happened to their kin, got up, preparing to run toward Deba. He frowned at his opponents, wondering if Elpam was crazy. He didn't understand how he was supposed to defeat these monsters, especially with the weapon he had first picked up. He assumed that he wouldn't survive here. Even if he had 9 lives like a cat, he didn't have much time to think, because one of the tree stumps got close to him and swung its paw to strike. Jumping out of the way just in time, he shouted that Elpam was a terrible boss, and swung his halir, driving the monsters away from him. While dodging the monsters' attacks, the main character, watching from the side, thought that Deba would have to master the halberd for a long time, but assumed that he would soon realize it was the best type of weapon for him. Elpam pursed his lips, frowning in concentration. He noted that he didn't even need to think about how much potential Deba had, since he was the only one that the halberd heroine had accepted as a disciple. He imagined her reaching out to him as she entered the dungeon where Deba now stood. But for the moment, Elpam was distracted from thinking about it, turning his attention to the ongoing battle. One of the monsters snarled and flew back, while Deba, running away from the stumps he had already injured, asked himself what was going on. His surprise came from realizing that the halberd was not such a bad weapon. It hit from a distance, struck strongly, and was much more convenient to use than a sword. As he swung another blow at the closest monster, he noticed that the halir was easier to hold in his hand, since it didn't require as much force. He asked himself if he could swing it more smoothly than the other weapon. After trying to do just that, he threw another strike which managed to cut the closest monster in 2. Realizing that this was the most effective way to fight, he began to act accordingly, destroying the monsters one by one, frowning in concentration and clenching his jaw. Elpam watched him, took in the change in his fighting technique, and thought that he had caught on quickly, and that was even before the circle had awakened. After a while Deba stopped, breathing heavily but still holding the halberd in a ready position, prepared to fight again at any moment. Sensing an unexpected earthquake, he raised his head and noticed that the birds and flying monsters, disturbed by the tremor, took off into the air. In the next instant, part of a tall rock cracked open and a huge pointed branch emerged from it at high speed. Deba watched in disbelief, frowning. In the next moment the crack in the rock suddenly widened, allowing a monster to burst out of it with a violent strike, flying to the side. Deba cried out in surprise. Sitting on his knees, he looked up at the monster and asked, "What is this nonsense?" Looking more closely, he assumed that it was a stump. At that moment the monster swung again to attack, but Elpam managed to run closer in time. Grabbing Deba, he pulled him away from the trajectory of the attack and threw him aside. Ignoring the fact that his partner cried out in surprise, the main character turned his attention to the monster and announced, "Being huge isn't always a good thing, because the monster becomes a convenient target." He launched a fire arrow forward, and Deba, grinning and frowning, thought that he was right, that the magic should work. However, before the fire arrow reached the monster's main body, it abruptly pushed forward one of its branches, repelling the attack. The explosion caused no damage. Elpam was surprised that the monster had deflected the arrow. He mentally noted that its reflexes were better developed than they appeared. Guessing what else he could do, he asked, "How about this?" Drawing the fire bowstring again, he launched a new arrow. Telekinesis began to change the direction of the arrow at high speed to disorient the monster. Finally, Elpam aimed an arrow at the monster to strike and assumed that it should succeed this time. However, the stump also managed to counter the attack, and Elpam widened his eyes, wondering how it had even stopped that blow. Deba, noticing this, shouted desperately, realizing that even the magic didn't work. He asked what Elpam was waiting for. He announced that it was necessary to leave and started running. The main character followed him as the monster, moving quickly, headed in their direction. Narrowing his eyes slightly, Elpam thought it must be using magic, because otherwise the monster wouldn't have been able to parry his arrow. Realizing that the branches themselves were hindering it, they kept running. The monster, which had almost caught up with them, struck again, and Elpam and Deba barely avoided the blow. Without slowing down, the monster swung another branch at them. Seeing it, Deba frowned, his mouth hanging open in horror. Suddenly, the main character used telekinesis, lifting a rather large slab off the ground and using it as a platform for movement. He jumped onto it and caught Deba on the same platform. Deba, bewildered, asked, "What is this?" Elpam didn't say anything but simply moved the platform farther away from the monster. Realizing what had happened, Deba exclaimed that it was great and thanked him, as he had already thought he was finished. Clearing his throat, he squeezed his eyes shut, but suddenly the main character called his name, drawing attention to himself, and ordered him to deal with the stumps. Deba, concentrating on something a little farther away from them, asked when those monsters had gotten there. He noticed a large number of stumps in front of him, but Elpam ignored the question and turned around, promising that he would take care of the stump himself. In the next instant, he ran forward. Deba, asking him to wait, stretched out his palm in Elpam's direction, but realizing that the main character was already too far away, he just sighed, exclaiming that he was very fast. Elpam, looking intently at the enemy, activated the fire staff, pointing an arrow in the monster's direction. Deba, opening his eyes wide, mentally shouted that it was useless, because the monster could not be defeated without tactics. He was sure they needed to step back and come up with a plan. In that instant, he noticed that the attack Elpam had launched had exploded again, never reaching the monster. Speaking mentally to it, he asked, "Can you even see it?" He remembered that he had already mentioned this before, but suddenly noticed the monster's eyes widen as another attack flew into its body, injuring it. Closing the eye where the blow had landed, the monster swerved to the side. Deba looked at it in amazement and shouted in his mind that it had worked. He was shocked by what had happened. Elpam activated his staff again, frowning as he calculated where to strike next. As the next arrow flew forward, he thought that the monster was moving its branches faster than expected, and that even telekinesis wouldn't help strike it directly. The tree repelled another attack by swinging a branch, and the main character thought that he could use two abilities at the same time if he had two circles. He noticed that after the arrow that the monster had just repelled, another fire attack flew toward it, one the monster could not repel. A fire arrow cut off one of its branches, and the monster screamed in pain. Deba grinned and thought it was amazing. Briefly distracted from the battle, he realized that Elpam had hidden one arrow behind another. Although the monster was agile, it would not be able to stop two blows in a row. It was hard for him to believe that the stump was being overpowered by only one man. He continued to watch as Elpam used his tactics to deal more and more blows to the monster. Deba assumed that the main character now was stronger than he had imagined. With a frown, he clenched his jaw and mentally told Elpam to shoot. But suddenly he gave a desperate cry, noticing that several stumps had broken through his defense and were running toward the calmly standing main character. Elpam closed his eyes in order to concentrate better. Deba warned him to be careful because there were monsters coming from behind. With a mental curse, he realized that he had missed a few monsters because there were simply too many. Elpam abruptly changed the direction of one of the fire arrows and directed it toward the incoming monsters, destroying them with a single blow. Looking at Deba seriously, he asked if he couldn't even deal with ordinary monsters. Noticing that the attacks had stopped, the stump opened its eyes wider, focusing its attention on Elpam. Then it swung its branch to attack. The main character managed to dodge, jumping to the side, and thought with displeasure that he didn't have a moment of calm. However, when he leaped into the air to dodge another attack, the monster took advantage of it and swung another branch directly at him in mid-air. Just in time, Deba got close enough to push Elpam aside and swung his howler, chopping off a branch of the monster. After landing carefully, he gave the protagonist a firm look. With a serious look, he said that he had saved him and announced that they were now even. Elpam smiled at this and, without arguing, suggested that the debt had been repaid. He activated the fire staff to create new arrows and, with a determined frown, proposed that it was time to finish the monster. Deba imitated the expression on his face and prepared for further battle, while the monster continued to swing its branches to attack them. Deba ran forward with his halberd at the ready, and Elpam readied several fire arrows, controlling them with telekinesis and waiting for the right opportunity to attack. Finally, he launched both arrows at the monster, distracting it with one of the attacks, and immediately destroying the branch it had used to deflect the previous arrow with the second shots. Suddenly, the monster turned around, noticing the new attack, and swung a branch to fend it off. But Deba, who had run closer in time, clenched his jaw, frowned furiously, and cut the branch with his halberd, allowing the fire arrow to pass through unhindered, causing damage to the other branches. The fire attacks caused several branches to break off and start burning. Elpam frowned in concentration, suddenly noticing that the monster was attacking Deba from both sides. As Deba fell, calling out his name, Elpam warned him that he would take care of the branch on the right and activated the staff, preparing to send a new fire arrow forward. Deba grinned, shouted that he could handle it, and turned toward the remaining branch. With a single blow, he chopped it off, and at the same time Elpam destroyed the second pointed branch that was reaching for Deba. Finally, when the immediate threat was eliminated, Deba dropped to the ground, landing cautiously, and immediately ran to attack again, repeatedly swinging his halberd to chop off several smaller branches nearby. But suddenly the monster managed to strike him from the side. Deba cried out, spitting out a blood clot from his mouth. The monster opened its mouth wide, pleased that it had managed to hit him, and prepared to devour him. Deba lost his balance and started to fall, screaming. Elpam, using his skill, left the stone platform and placed it under the falling Deba, preventing him from falling into the monster's mouth. Suddenly, the monster swung a branch and destroyed the platform Deba was sitting on. He screamed and started falling again, trying to reach for the halberd he had accidentally dropped. Elpam frowned in displeasure, thinking that his opponent was very annoying. He stopped the falling stones, and Deba, taking advantage of this, landed on one of the platforms, catching the halberd. He was forced to lean closer to the surface of the stone as the monster waved a branch, about to strike him again. Cursing in frustration, Deba shouted that there was no end to these branches. While dodging the blows, he used the rocks still hanging in the air to run up them and attack the monster. At the same time, Elpam launched another fire arrow and destroyed another of the monster's branches. Distracted from Deba, the monster turned toward Elpam. Frowning in annoyance, Elpam announced that it was time to end this, and drew Deba's attention to himself. Deba, approaching the monster from the side, swung his halberd with a frown of concentration and stabbed the monster in the eye. Blood sprayed everywhere, and the monster closed its eyes, twitching violently. Deba, whose weapon was stuck in the monster's eye, gripped the handle tightly to keep from falling. However, he couldn't hold on for long and eventually let go of the hilt. Letting out a startled cry, he flew off toward a nearby rock, managed to land carefully, and glared at the monster, calling it names and warning that it wasn't over yet. Abruptly pushing off from the rock, he flew in the direction of the monster, which was still standing with its eyes closed. Elpam clenched his hand into a fist and activated telekinesis, directing it toward the halberd. With a sharp jerk of his hand, he pulled the weapon out of the monster's eye and redirected it so that Deba could catch the handle. Still frowning, Deba addressed the monster with a deliberate, disdainful look and announced that it was time for dessert. After saying that, he swung the halberd sharply, destroying the monster's second eye. A large amount of blood splattered into the air, smearing Deba, and the monster screamed, squeezing its eyes shut. Deba struck at the monster's remaining eye again. The monster began twitching violently from side to side. Unable to hold on to the body, Deba began to fall, crying out. Despite the unexpected fall, he managed to regroup mid-air so he could land carefully. But when he looked up, he noticed that the monster was opening its mouth and moving toward him, intending to devour him. He opened his mouth in shock and just watched. Suddenly, several fire arrows flew past him and into the monster, strengthening the attack. The fire arrows reached the core of the monster's body and destroyed it. The monster was engulfed in flames and burned up. Watching the monster, Deba sighed heavily, trying to calm down. Elpam came closer to him and praised him. His face was still serious. After a short silence, Deba turned to him and said that he had done great as well. A short time later, the monster fell, unable to stand on its own 2 feet, but Deba and Elpam continued to stand there despite the fire being very close to them. Some time passed and night fell over Maple World. However, there was still a light on in one of the windows in the city. Devi, sitting alone at the table, tilted her head while looking at the plate of food in front of her. Realizing it was very late, she decided she needed to eat quickly and go to bed. Cupping her hands together, she closed her eyes and wished herself a good meal, but was suddenly distracted by a knock on the door. Startled for a moment, she whirled around and went to the door, opening it a crack and asking who was there. Suddenly she froze, her eyes widening as she saw him standing in the doorway, his clothes and body still slightly smeared with blood. Even so, he tried to smile. Devi asked if it was really her brother. He simply said that he was back. She tried to control her emotions, clenching the fabric of her clothes so tightly that her palms shook. She couldn't stop the tears from running down her cheeks. She ran to Deba and hugged him, congratulating him on his return. Around the same time, in a house that stood alone in the woods, Elpam stood looking at a bed where a man lay motionless. He clutched the fire staff in his hands and tightened his lips. A little away on a cabinet was a photograph of a younger Elpam and a man with his hands on Elpam's shoulders, both of them smiling happily. But ignoring this image, Elpam looked at the severely emaciated man whose body was covered in dark spots. Frowning, he didn't move for a while before activating his magic. He concentrated the energy next to the fire staff and a little later released an attack that caused the house to catch fire. He started walking away, not turning around and not paying attention to the burning house behind him. Later, sitting in his office, Abu sighed and said it was a problem. He sat with a lit cigarette between his teeth, his fingers resting wearily on his forehead. With a frown, he noted that it was time to send people to the 100-person gate, but he didn't know who to choose. He remembered that Lin was responsible for this trip, and understood what would happen if it failed. This trip was very important, and would attract the attention of all the guilds. Out of the top 10, the 100-player gate had to contain items of epic rank or higher. He estimated there might even be legendary-level items. He honestly admitted to himself that it would be difficult. As he tapped ash from his cigarette into the ashtray, he thought of the 3 Natasha sisters from the Gold Guild. They were so strong it was hard to believe their second circle strength rank. He pictured them standing atop a mountain of corpses and noted that compared to them, second circle adventurers from the Gapor Guild were ashamed to be called adventurers. However, even without them, the seekers from the 10 major guilds were still a threat. After all, the Gapor Guild was the weakest among the major guilds. He didn't want to admit this, so he took his mind off it and looked at the questionnaire with Elom's picture on it. Abruptly, the door to his office swung open. Abel looked up and asked, with disgust, who dared to barge in without knocking. His indignation quickly faded, however, and he stood up, frowning as Lean entered. Lean didn't say anything. He just tightened his lips and asked a little later about the team lineup. Walking to the back of the office, he sat down in the chair Abby had been sitting in. He bowed his head and apologized for not being done with the lineup yet. Lin pointed out that this wasn't like him and asked how their friend was doing. Abby admitted that he still had reasons to worry. With a sigh, Lin realized Abi was still doubtful. Abi explained that the Chev group was destroyed last time, and since there were no witnesses, it was impossible to determine what exactly happened in the dungeon. He knew that Elpam was clearly talented, but said that wasn't the problem. Lin raised a hand and suggested Abba check on the main character again, whether he was crazy or not. Abba looked at him quizzically, then opened his mouth in surprise. Lin, thinking of something, told him to gather all the candidates and offered to give them a little push. After that, he put his hand under his chin and grinned, adding that this time there would be a lot of witnesses. Sometime later, when Deba arrived at the gate located in the forest following behind Elpam, he cried out in surprise. This time there were a lot of people. Although he noted that this was usually the case, his reaction came from seeing an unusually large number of people in front of the gate, all preparing to enter it. The main character didn't say anything but continued walking forward. Suddenly, he stopped as the person in front of him asked if they were the 15. It was Ibar, who crossed his arms over his chest and frowned in displeasure, noting with disdain that they were 2 former slaves. Elpam did not respond to this provocation. Elpam only slightly narrowed his eyes, looking around at the opponents and noticing the displeased expressions on their faces. It was immediately clear to him that they were not welcome here. The more experienced the team, the more confident they became that the former slaves were just a nuisance. Looking at the hand closest to him and Ibar, he assumed they had 1 or 2 rounds of experience, noting that they were different from Chev's team. With their abilities, they had no need for bait. Suddenly Ibar approached, followed by 2 men, and ordered everyone to gather. The adventurers were distracted from their conversations, turning their attention to him and marveling that he had come in person. Abel, as a cur in his mouth, frowned, warned them not to rant, and told them they were going to run a test. Those who demonstrated their abilities would get a special chance. Ibar asked in disbelief, and Abi grinned, held out his hand to the side, confirmed it, and announced that this would be a chance to enter the gate for 100 people. All the adventurers were surprised to hear about the gate limit. Ibar asked again, "Is this a gate for 100 people?" Ibar added that this would be a major opportunity. Elpam, who remained calm, wondered if Abi was planning to turn things around this way. Finally, Abi suggested they begin and looked at the gate, which was designed for 40 people. Soon the portal activated, and after passing through it, the adventurers began looking around, wondering if the forest was part of the test as well. Frowning, Ibar turned to Dolan and asked if it was true that just killing the boss together was enough. In that case, he suggested they split up and meet again when they received the signal. Without any argument, the adventurers split into teams and spread out into the forest. Elpam and Dubba were still standing near the portal, looking thoughtfully after their opponents, while the main character Elpam remained calm. Dubba slightly lowered his head, pursing his lips more tightly. One of the teams, led by Dolan, was passing through the woods. With a serious frown, he drew his comrades' attention, warning them that time was short and ordering them to make the most of it. A girl on his team smiled confidently and agreed. Suddenly, Dolan frowned harder and started when he heard a sound from the bushes. As he got closer, he noticed a monster and asked in displeasure, "Is it really just one monster?" He was also annoyed that it was mushrooms again and said scornfully that they were wasting their time. Holding out his staff, he began concentrating a magic attack. His team members grinned as they watched. Using an energy bolt, Dolan directed it at the monster, thinking it was too boring, and ordered his team to take the magic stone, saying that afterward they would move on. However, when the magic light and rising dust dispersed, he and the other adventurers noticed that the monster was still intact. They were very surprised, asking, "Is the monster still alive?" Startled, Dolan asked in amazement, "Could it be that magic attacks don't work on this monster?" If that was the case, it meant other team members were about to join the battle. But before he could finish, Dolan was distracted as the wind picked up. He told everyone to stop and warned them to be careful, noticing that a large number of similar monsters had appeared nearby. The team members stood back to fend off the monster's attacks from all directions and realized with horror that they were surrounded. They fought for a while, and when the last monster screamed, fell to the ground and died, the team members froze, panting and closing their eyes. They were finally done and extremely tired. The girl, drawing Dolan's attention to herself, shouted that the monsters were stronger than expected and asked what they would do. He frowned, pursing his lips tighter, and noted that there were too many of these monsters. If this went on, their strength would quickly run out. Even though the risk was high, he suggested breaking the alliance and killing the boss himself. The girl looked at him quizzically. Meanwhile, Elpam told Deba what most teams would be thinking. Deba, who stopped leaning on his halberd and began breathing heavily to calm down, agreed. He assumed this would be the case since those teams were too proud. Suddenly, he changed the subject. Noticing that Elpam had only been talking so far, he asked if he was going to help. Elpam, looking at the corpses of the monsters lying next to Deba, reminded him that there were only 3 opponents, so he could handle it himself. Deba paid particular attention to what Elpam said about there being only 3 monsters, but added that they didn't have time to sit around. Elpam agreed and warned him to act. Deba, with a determined frown, suggested that the boss hunt should begin. At the same time, Elpam declared that they would destroy all the monsters. Hearing his words, Deba asked in bewilderment, "What does that mean?" He reminded Elpam that he had just spoken about the boss. Elpam gave him a slightly displeased look, and explained that others would think that was their goal, noting that they would take care of the other monsters instead. He noted that killing a boss isn't the only measure of ability, and that hunting small monsters is also taken into account. In addition, it could be dangerous to compete with a large number of groups determined to attack the boss, because it was difficult to predict what they would do in order to restrain each other. The Dada realized that it might be very difficult to break through, and thought with a frown that this was all annoying. Still, he admitted that Elpam was right. The main character suddenly added that, in addition, there was danger coming from this gate, and looked seriously straight ahead. While Dolan's team was moving further into the forest, the girl suddenly drew his attention and asked him to look in the direction she was pointing. He paused, puzzled, and she explained that it was a gateway to return. Noticing an area with a gate off to the side, Dolan admitted that he didn't want to look for it now but decided that it would be good if it turned out to be useful later. He said they would leave a mark on the road and all the other members of the team agreed. Suddenly, a band stopped and laughed out loud. Dolan frowned at him and asked what was the matter. He told him to be quiet, but a band continued laughing. Annoyed, Dolan walked up to him, put a hand on his shoulder, and asked if he hadn't heard what he said. He was about to warn him that his laughter might attract monsters, when a band suddenly turned around. Dolan let go of his shoulder in horror and asked, "What does that mean?" His astonishment was due to the fact that Elpam was laughing uncontrollably, trembling, while sweat flowed profusely down his face and mixed with the tears falling from his eyes. He narrowed his eyes, looking desperately at Dolan. All of a sudden, Dolan heard the rest of his team laugh too. He clenched his jaw as he noticed the mist forming around them. Covering his nose and mouth with his hand, he realized it was poison. Cursing, he decided that he had to get out on his own. He started running in the direction of the gate, but suddenly, a huge monster appeared right behind him, its mouth wide open, watching him. Dolan kept running anyway. The monster released a fresh dose of venom from the pores on its body, and Yo frowned as he noticed it spread all around them. The monster opened its mouth wide, showing its teeth, and laughed. At that moment, Dolan, no longer able to resist the poison, took his hand away from his mouth and laughed too. Sweat broke out on his face, but he couldn't stop laughing out loud. Frozen in place, some time later, Elpam and Deba were walking along the upper edge of a canyon with a fast-flowing river at its bottom. Deba, looking at the back of the lead protagonist in front of him, silently called him a name in his mind, wondering if he was even going to fight today. He was unhappy that only he had been participating in battles, but suddenly, he was distracted from his indignation. Looking to the side in surprise, he opened his eyes wider when he noticed a red signal light in the sky. Drawing Elpam's attention to it, he announced that it was the signal to assemble. Elpam also stopped, raising his head to look at the signal. As they approached, the other teams were already gathered at the designated place. Deba admitted he was a little surprised. They had notified everyone when they found the main monster. He smiled slightly while Elpam frowned and narrowed his eyes, gravely appraising the other adventurers standing opposite them. He realized there was one team missing. Eber sighed and frowned, assuming that everyone else was already there, and decided to begin the explanation. Suddenly Shabar, drawing his attention to herself, reminded him that Wizard Dolan's team was still missing. Eber announced that there was no point in waiting for them since they had already discovered the boss. After saying that, he frowned and added that it was also the monster that had killed Dolan and his companions. He remembered seeing the monster with Dolan's team members, its mouth smeared with blood, as well as the hand holding the body of one of Dolan's teammates in its fist. The boss of this place was Toto the clown. Jabbar, hearing this, frowned and asked, "Is he really serious?" All the adventurers knew that their teams would not be strong enough for such a battle. If that was the case, then it was useless to try to clear the gate. They would have to find a way out, and that was all. Deba, who was standing with Elpam a little to the side, caught his attention and asked warily, "Is this clown mushroom really that dangerous?" The main character realized who the boss was and mentally noted that, with their current level, meeting Toadstool was the most dangerous scenario for them. Noticing that Elpam wasn't responding to his words, Deba tried calling out to him and asked if he was even listening. Still ignoring him, Elpam held his chin in his hand and thought. Because of the poison in the spores that the monsters were releasing around them, melee combat didn't make sense. It couldn't be captured in a pincer attack either. That meant this monster would need to be killed using ranged combat, but given its unimaginable speed and strength, the mushroom couldn't be attacked without a plan. While he was thinking, Deba was still trying to get his attention. With an exasperated frown, he finally called out Elpam's name, ordering him not to ignore it. Eber finally crossed his arms over his chest and announced that, unfortunately, the Toadstool was standing right in front of the exit gate, so the only way to get to it was through the boss. Deba chuckled, frowned confidently, lightly slammed his fist against his chest, and asked, "Is that a problem?" He was sure that it would be possible to deal with the Toadstool with just one of Elpam's fire arrows, but before he could finish, the main character said his name seriously and ordered him to be quiet. Annoyed by this attitude, Deba gritted his teeth in displeasure and frowned as he mentally cursed Elpam. Meanwhile, Elpam stated that without a good strategy, they would all die because the fire arrow wouldn't even be able to scratch this miracle monster. Deba's eyes widened as he asked, "Why is that so?" Elpam explained that even ordinary monsters here had a solid hide, so there was no point even thinking about the boss. The adventurers were all silent for a while, considering this information. Finally, Eber exclaimed in exasperation, "What is this nonsense?" He realized that the slaves were clearly visible, but before he could continue, one of the adventurers approached him and excitedly said that now was not the time for this, that they needed a solution. Suddenly Elpam raised his hand and said he was demanding 50,000 mullahs per person. Hearing this, Eber frowned in bewilderment and asked, "What does that mean?" Still holding his palm up, the main character estimated that there were 30 adventurers, so they would need to pay 1.5 million mouse. They all stood listening intently as he pointed a finger at Deba, who was standing behind them, and promised that if they paid, he and Deba would act as bait. Deba's mouth dropped open in surprise at his words, but he said nothing. For a while everyone just stood there frozen in silence. Then, as if finally processing what Elpam had said, Deba put his hands in his hair, frowned, and asked himself if the main character had gone completely mad. Suddenly Eber, unable to control his emotions, angrily ordered Elpam not to interfere. He suggested that the slave's mindset was still not completely worn out, but warned him not to think everything would go his way. He insisted the bait wouldn't help in this situation, because if the useless bait died immediately, it would be all over for the adventurers. That was why in high-level gates, slaves would only get in the way. Stepping forward, Eber pointed at Deba and Elpam and asked, "Who the hell are you to suggest such a thing?" Then he paid special attention to Deba and noted that, from what he had heard, Deba hadn't even woken up yet. He questioned what a man with the second circle and a slave could possibly do. Deba frowned, noting that Eber, whom he had always looked down on, was beginning to infuriate him. He didn't understand why Eber was always pushing people around, and he also noted that Eber hadn't even considered becoming bait himself. Trying to contain his rage, Deba clenched his jaw so tightly that veins became visible on his face. While Deba barely contained his anger, the protagonist remained calm. Holding out his palms, he asked, What does Aber suggest? He assumed that Aber must have a better option, but as he noticed Aber muttering and hesitating, he realized there was no other plan because otherwise Aber wouldn't have gathered them all here. Closing his eyes, the protagonist added that there was something else. Crossing his arms over his chest, he announced that their team had one person with the second circle and one person with the first circle. Deba was very surprised to hear this and asked, "Is this really serious?" He looked down at his wrist, noticing a glowing circle on it. With a happy smile, he asked, "When did this appear?" Laughing, he suggested that he had a talent after all. Elpam reminded him that the other adventurers only had a few people with the second circle. Hearing this, Ibra clenched his teeth in exasperation and frowned, about to protest something, but suddenly Jabbar ran forward and asked him to stop. She held out her hand in front of her, then placed it on her chest and promised that she would pay if Elpam became bait. She frowned confidently, though she admitted that she didn't have 100,000 for the two of them right now. Closing his eyes, the protagonist waved his hand and said she could pay once they got out of there. He added that if they couldn't escape, they would simply sacrifice themselves. However, when he opened his eyes, he looked seriously at the others and added that his condition was the consent of absolutely everyone. The adventurers shivered as they looked at him, and when he ordered them to decide, they became thoughtful. Meanwhile, the boss continued sitting near the return gate, surrounded by poisonous mist, eating the bodies of Dolan's team members. However, it was suddenly distracted when it felt a sharp gust of wind off to the side. Turning its head, the monster saw a fire arrow flying toward it. The attack came too unexpectedly for it to dodge. The arrow slammed into the monster, exploded, and briefly blinded it, sending clouds of dust into the air. While the monster was disoriented, Elpam, who had launched the arrow, ordered Deba to run as soon as the monster found them. Deba, his halberd at the ready, asked desperately, "What's all this for?" Finally, when the dust cleared, the mushroom noticed them and immediately jumped forward, running in the direction of Deba and Elpam. The main character shouted, "We need to start acting," and ran along with his companion, who frowned and asked why the monster was so fast. The mushroom, moving quickly, opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and was already quite close to Deba and Elpam. Jabbar, noticing that the monster had run away from the gate, peeked out from behind her shelter, frowning and shouting that she needed to act now. She decided they should activate the gate before the bait died. One of the adventurers ran up to the gate, placing his hand on it, and a bright light appeared between the two pillars, transforming into a portal. One by one, the adventurers began rushing through the opening portal. Jabbar, waving her arms, hurried the remaining companions. Meanwhile, the mushroom continued to chase Elpam and Deba, who was already sweating. He frowned, suddenly noticing other monsters ahead, running to intercept them. Displeased, he asked, "Is this really serious?" Gripping the hilt of his halberd tighter, he asked if the monsters thought he would be so easy to deal with. He activated magic, and his weapon was enveloped in a fiery aura. Eber swung it, ordered the monsters to leave, and activated a slashing blast. When he struck out, he cut down several monsters at once. The fire-enhanced aura dealt much more damage. However, despite his success with those monsters, Deba suddenly opened his eyes wide as he sensed the presence of another monster behind him. Before the toadstool, already opening its mouth to attack, could deal him any damage, Elpam activated a fire arrow. Although it did not harm the boss, the force of the attack knocked it off its feet and pushed it back. Taking advantage of this, Elpam and Deba began to run away. The monster roared angrily, and before it could rise again, the protagonist decided he needed to attack once more and sent a new fire arrow. This time, the monster managed to dodge. With no intention of giving up, Elpam used telekinesis to turn the arrow back, directing it to attack the monster from behind. However, the mushroom anticipated the move, leaped forward and dodged. Crying out, the monster continued to evade while the arrow remained active. The main character repeatedly changed the direction of the arrow, but the monster managed to avoid each attack. Finally, the mushroom managed to get ahead, catching up with Elpam and Deba. Seeing this, Deba warned the main character that the monster was approaching. Elpam said nothing but focused on the cliff they were approaching. When he reached the edge, he shouted that they needed to jump. Without hesitation, Deba leapt after him. The monster, which had already swung its arm to strike, failed to land a blow. Suddenly it was distracted by someone calling out to it and drawing attention. It was Deba, who frowned, grinned, made an obscene gesture at the monster and told it to stay put. Regrouping in mid-air, the main character held his staff in front of him, activated a fire arrow, and frowned as he focused, directing the attack at the monster. When the fire arrow collided with the boss, it turned into a powerful explosion. Elpam and Deba fell into the water of a fast-flowing river. After some time passed, Deba and the main character emerged from the water. For a while Deba froze, waiting for most of the moisture to drain from his body. Sighing wearily, he called the toadstool a name, saying they had almost died there. He was on his knees, leaning on his hands, with his head lowered. Elam had already risen to his feet and was calmly wringing out his cloak. Noticing that Elam didn't react at all to his words, Deba grew angrier. He looked at Elam and asked, "What are you even doing?" Still breathing heavily and ignoring the water dripping from his face, Elam calmly replied that Deba himself had heard it was the main monster, so they needed preparation to kill it. Deba froze at those words and just sat there for a while, watching the main character twist the cloth of his cloak to squeeze out excess water. Finally he smiled and called Elam a respected boss, joking that he sounded as if they were going on a night hunt. He asked if it was possible he had misunderstood him. Elam calmly replied, "That's true." Deba frowned and asked, "Are you kidding?" The main character didn't understand why he was shouting and asked, "Didn't we come here to hunt monsters?" Deba admitted that he didn't know the mushroom was so dangerous at the time and asked if Elam had heard of a strategic retreat. Elam reminded them that if they left the gate, they couldn't return. Deba shouted angrily, "I know that." Recalling the image of a monster with a bloody mouth, he noted that they were no longer bait and asked, "Doesn't that mean we need to run away?" He didn't understand how the main character planned to win if his arrows were useless. Clenching his jaw in exasperation, he asked, "Is this really such a strange way to commit suicide?" Elam finally said, closing his eyes. He then announced that the situation had changed since their competitors were gone, so were their obligations. He asked, "Isn't this beautiful?" Opening his eyes, he looked down at Deba and asked, "Am I wrong?" He then suggested he wanted to terminate their contract. Deba looked at him in surprise and opened his mouth to say something but didn't answer right away. Finally, with a more determined frown, he sighed, ran a hand through his hair and explained that he didn't mean it that way. He asked if it wasn't true that they needed to earn more money. Lemine smiled faintly, noting that this was all true. Deba, finally getting to his feet, asked him to listen and explain how they would kill the toadstool if all attacks were useless. He had assumed that fighting this monster would mean condemning himself to death. With a wary frown, he asked if there were really any ways to win. Liam just looked at him, narrowing his eyes slightly, but didn't answer. At about the same time, the gate in the forest lit up. Abelise, who had been standing nearby all this time, waiting for the adventurers to return, asked in surprise, "Are they really coming out already?" He assumed this was all too fast for a 40-person gate. He drew the attention of Jawar, who had fallen to her knees panting. He asked, "What's up with the hunt?" He noticed not all of them were out yet, and more importantly, the people he was particularly thinking about weren't among them. Riora shouted that the hunt had failed. With a frown, she added that Dolan's team had been killed and that Elam and his partner were still inside. She explained that they had only been able to escape because the main character and Deba had become the bait, and added that they would never have been able to defeat the boss on their own. Abiz listened intently and was silent for a while. When she finished, he frowned in exasperation and asked what all this meant. He was angry that the adventurers had just run away. Jor stood up and gave him a serious look, announcing that the boss was a poisonous clown toadstool known for its cruelty. She asked what they were supposed to do. Abbas didn't answer right away. He tossed the rest of his cigarette onto the ground, crushed it under his foot, and turned around, saying they were leaving. The men who accompanied him bowed their heads and acquiesced to his suggestion. Riora, looking after him in surprise, asked him to wait. With a desperate frown, she reminded him that Elam was still inside, and if the gate was still active, it meant he was alive. Abias said it wouldn't be for long, reminding her that she herself had said the boss was a poisonous clown toadstool. As he walked further away from her, he told the adventurers that they could wait for Adventurer Elpam if they wanted, but he had things to do himself. Ja just stood there, looking after him, her hand slightly raised, but she didn't say anything. Abias frowned and mentally called the adventurers useless idiots. He knew the situation wasn't encouraging. A man with only second circle magic would never be able to kill Toadstool, which meant the outcome for Adventurer Elpam was all but certain. But he didn't need those who could only run away. At that moment, the toadstool was standing in the middle of the forest, its mouth wide open, emitting noxious smoke. Abias thought to himself that he wanted someone who could do the impossible. Some distance away from the toadstool, Elpam was standing on top of a cliff, drawing a fire bowstring and aiming at the monster, frowning in concentration. Finally, he announced that they were starting the hunt, and fired a fiery arrow that flew down the cliff at high speed to reach the distant boss. Compared to other bosses, this toadstool was very strong and fast, and the situation was further complicated by the poisonous fumes it emitted. Elpam knew that all he had to do was keep his distance and apply pressure. However, he noted that with the fire arrow's current level, this was problematic. With no intention of giving up, he activated his telekinesis. He reasoned that if he rotated the arrow at high speed, its penetration ability would increase. He did exactly that, and noted that the arrow was essentially turning into a bullet. In the Maple world, only he could use this method, which allowed him to do the impossible. This skill was called revolver. Elpam spun the fire arrow forward with great speed. The mushroom didn't immediately notice the incoming attack. Finally seeing the fire, it cried out in disbelief. In the next instant, the arrow struck the boss with such force that it flew back slightly. Losing its balance, it opened its mouth wide, screaming. As Elpam continued to twist the fire arrow, the monster's skin also twisted. Because the attack was enhanced by the additional skill, it was able to break through the thick skin of the mushroom and penetrate inside. The main character frowned in concentration, noticing that the arrow, after passing through the monster, continued flying and burned through several trees. Seeing the hole that had appeared in the monster's chest, he thought, slightly annoyed that he had hoped to break through the head and core at once, but had missed.